Welcome to Men Talk Ubuntu podcast. Our guest this episode is Dr. Yvon Guest. Yvon is a psychodynamic counselor with a PhD in trauma and resilience. She has created an intersectional practice, and the key issues that clients bring is around problematic identities. Yvon has spent her first 18 years in the care system and is still rebellious at every given opportunity. When she isn't working, she's winding down in nature, loves cooking, and is just getting into making chocolate. Hanging out with her family and playing computer games are some of her other passions. Yvon, it's a pleasure to have you here. Please tell us about your story and journey.
Oh, it's so great to meet you, Shai, and I really appreciate the invitation to come and talk to you. I don't usually get asked questions like this. I'm usually presenting or training or talking. So it's really interesting for me to be almost on the other side and being asked some questions. So I'm sure it's going to be interesting. We've been laughing already, so I think it's going to be fun. It's great to have that introduction. Yes, I'm Dr. Yvon Guest. I still get a huge thrill out of being able to call myself Dr. Guest. I use it all the time. There is no humility. I book restaurants and I say Dr. Guest. I call people up, I say Dr. Guest. It's just something I don't think sometimes people of colour celebrate enough about our achievements. And so I think I've had that title for about 6 years now, and it doesn't get old. So that's great. So
Never.
as you just said, Shai, I'm a therapist. I live in Bristol. I've been in Bristol for 25 years this year. And before that, I was in London, and before that, I was in the Midlands. So I've lived in the major cities, mostly in the inner cities for my adult life. But last year, I moved to the suburbs, kind of suburbs countryside, because I love nature, and I'm loving it. I'm absolutely loving it. It's real peace of mind. I really do enjoy it. So I work as a therapist. Obviously, I used to work face-to-face, which I really enjoyed. But obviously, I've had to go online because of COVID-19, which has changed everything. I was very reluctant to go onto Zoom. I really didn't want to. But as soon as I did it, I realized it was actually a very good thing, because there are lots and lots of Black and brown people who can't find a therapist in their small town, or if they live in the countryside, or even if it's a small city, they can't find a therapist of colour to go and see face to face. So the great thing about Zoom is I can talk to people all over this country, all over the United Kingdom. I've even got clients on other continents. So actually, when I finally sort of dived in and went onto Zoom, it was like, okay, this has taken away a huge barrier around accessibility. So I'm really pleased with that. So I work pretty much on Zoom all the time now.
That's wonderful. Thank you for that introduction, Yvon. And I'm so tempted to start asking if there's something to do with being online and anonymous, or not having to go through certain procedures or be visible that's encouraging people to come forward, or whether that's always been the case and with just availability. But I won't. I'll save that for a minute. Because firstly, and most importantly, I'd like to ask you, on a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being on the lower end, with 10 being on the high and extremely fun end, where are you mentally?
At this moment in time,
Yes.
I would say I'm a good 9, because I had a week off just last week, and I did very little, and it's been really great. I've been out walking in nature, sleeping a lot, reading, watching rubbish TV, playing computer games, making chocolate, all the things I love to do. So this week right now I am a 9.
Fantastic. That's wonderful to hear. It sounds like a very recharging week, if that makes sense, if that's a word.
Yeah, I definitely feel like I've recharged. I think in the beginning I was fighting the fact that it was quiet, like, oh, this doesn't really feel like a holiday. What am I doing? I just seem to be sleeping. And then as the quiet went on, I started to really embrace it and was like, oh, this is what I needed. I didn't realize, but I just needed this quiet. And so once I started to stop fighting that and started to embrace it, I really enjoyed it. Really enjoyed it.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating how often sometimes we fight against being good and kind to ourselves for some reason. And yet, if we're, say, pushing ourselves at work, for example, we will push ourselves to no end.
Yeah.
But to just take a few minutes of quietness to
Yeah.
contemplate or something. And I know you mentioned nature a lot, and you mentioned that being quite important, or an important discovery or addition since moving to Bristol. Is that something that you also do sort of alone and to enjoy more quiet time, or is it a more social thing?
It's a real mixture. When I'm working, I work Tuesday to Friday. So those days, I will always start the day with a walk. My garden backs out onto this beautiful, huge piece of country. So I'll be out there in the morning if I'm working, or maybe I'll go in the afternoon, or maybe when I've finished. But the days I work, I would definitely do it on my own. I find being a therapist, I'm always listening to other people's voices. And so I do walk on my own quite often, or sit on my own completely quietly to just not be listening to voices. But I love being with other people. I love taking my granddaughters. I have two granddaughters, Amira and Anaya. They're rising 8 and rising 6. I love being in nature with them because they're just funny. You know, they want to jump in the mud and fall in the water and climb things and chase dogs and pick up conkers and stuff like that. So yeah, I like the social part, but I also like the alone time. I think for me, there's something about being alone that facilitates the most recharging of my batteries. I can literally feel them recharging because I'm not giving anything to anybody else. So I can actually feel those power levels going up again.
So I can relate to that totally.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I think when you mentioned making chocolate, I was like, you often don't make chocolate, for example, to just eat by yourself. Although if you do, I won't judge. But
I do.
but I was going to say, often you might make chocolate to share out. And
Sometimes,
yeah.
Occasionally.
If it's that good, enjoy it. And it made me think about the energy in a similar way of you make chocolate to give out to a lot of other people. And before you know it, you've barely got a piece left for yourself, especially if people love it because you want to produce more and make more.
Yeah.
And it's the same with our own energy levels, where we might not pay attention to how much we're giving away and feel guilty about keeping it to ourselves and just what we can do with that. But there's nothing wrong with that either. Like I say, it's a mix. When you mention your grandchildren having this adventurous spirit and that curiosity that children just have when it comes to nature, were you similar in the same respect, or did you grow up where you were able
I was really lucky because from when I was 7 to 14, we moved to this sort of small town, and then there was like countryside all around us. This was the late 60s, so we were allowed to go off then, like all day, and ride our bikes. And there's a beautiful part of the Midlands called Cannock Chase. It's absolutely beautiful. So we could just go there every day on our bikes, have adventures, you know, take a box of matches, make a little fire. Nobody told you off. If you asked for a box of matches, you could ask for a can opener and some tin food, and nobody said you can't have those things. A little knife if you wanted, you know. Off you went for the day, come back at tea time. So I was very, very lucky to have that freedom, and it was real freedom just in nature. And I think I found it very calming even then. I think partly because being mixed race in a very white environment, I was incredibly visible, but going into nature, I was could like hide a bit in the nature, and I think perhaps realized at a very early age that it felt a bit safer.
Yeah, I think visible is a very astute way of putting it, because if everyone's almost watching you, anyone can imagine that. It's like stepping on stage. If everyone's looking at you, every step is almost premeditated. You know, you have to really think about you. There's a lot of pressure on you. And like you say, it must be very freeing. Freedom is a beautiful way to express what we can experience when we're in the outdoors. And with you touching on that, and especially with this element of growing up, like you say, mixed race in a very white area, I'd like to ask, what your mental health story is. It doesn't have to be about you, but just that we're touching on
No,
that
it's
point, that might
fine.
weave it back
No,
in.
it's fine. It's fine. It's funny when I was thinking about this interview, I was thinking, how can you talk about your own mental health story without your parents' mental health story, you know? And I kind of like just go backwards a little bit. I think, you know, my mother had real mental health problems, I think all her life. And I think that it's really difficult. I think, you know, I was born in 1962, so my dad was Jamaican, my mum was English. So you've got two people that made mixed race children, and they made a lot. Okay, they made a lot of them. None of them grew up with either parent because they were all taken into care or taken back. I've got a brother and sister who were taken back to Africa by their father, but all the mixed race ones here in England got taken into care. So I think you have to think, well, why did that happen? And I think that's because, you know, my dad was from Jamaica. He was a very intelligent man. He was a skilled worker, but he didn't have any power here. My mum was working class and white, so they couldn't fight to get their children back. You know, they couldn't sort of say, you know, okay, we're struggling. If you just helped us a bit, we could perhaps do a bit better. So, you know, I think you have to start with that story.
Yes.
Of what powerlessness means in this country if you're poor and white and if you're poor and black. So we have to kind of start there. And I think the other thing is, obviously, I've researched this a lot because the majority of my clients are mixed race. And I think what people don't realize is that in the 60s, it wasn't illegal in this country to create mixed race children. It wasn't illegal, but it was a social taboo. So it meant people were like, on both sides, black and white, were like, you shouldn't be doing that. You shouldn't be making mixed race children. It was seen as diluting the races on both sides. Okay. So I'll give you an example. My grandparents in Jamaica didn't know that we'd been born. They didn't know that any of us had been born. I only found out in 1992 when I met my aunt, my dad's sister. And she said, oh no, our grandparents, your dad couldn't tell them that he'd made some mixed race children. And I'm like, whoa, that is harsh, you know, because I was so used to it from the other side, from the white side. Like, you know, you shouldn't make mixed race children. That's a terrible thing to do. You're diluting the white race. But to hear that it had also happened from the other side, I was like, okay. So I think, yeah, I think so growing up in care obviously was difficult. You have to deal with, I think anybody who's grown up in care will say you've got to just, inside you always have that feeling that your parents gave you away. But when you find out the truth, like I did, that actually, no, they wanted us back, but they couldn't get us back, you know, that sort of changes the narrative a bit. But you grow up feeling that if you're adopted or if you're fostered, you feel like, oh, why did my parents give us away? Then we must have been bad, you know, to be given away. And then society piles layers of that on top of you. Oh, if you live in a children's home, you must be a really bad child. You know, what did you do that was so bad? Bad child. So you grow up with that, and that's a real stigma. And then there's a stigma of being mixed race as well. So yeah, I would say my mental health was pretty compromised from a very early age, very, very early age. And I think the difference now is because of my self-education.
Yes.
You know, having to really, I've looked at like white working class history, I've looked at Black history, I've looked at, obviously I'm a therapist now, so I call myself psychosocial. I want to look at what oppresses people from society, you know, whether you're Black or gay or disabled or poor,
that's
gender
the
issues,
element.
you know, that whole, that's why I'm so intersectional. And I think self-education has made a massive difference. And I can say, okay, all right, there was nothing wrong with me. Okay, there was nothing wrong with my parents. They just happened to be poor and powerless. You know, when children's protective services were created, they were never supposed to look at the middle classes. They were only supposed to put that lens on the poor. So, you know, they'll haul us away at the drop of a hat It seemed like in the 60s, but that lens was never focused anywhere else. So there's some serious oppression. And I think if you follow the media right now, there's lots of women saying my child was taken away and I would like an apology. It's a big, big thing now about all the women whose children were taken away just because they were unmarried mothers or teenage mothers, something like that. So yes, self-education's made a big difference. And I think it's something I do a lot with my clients is like, oh, you don't understand that illegitimacy was such a big deal. You don't understand that creating mixed race children right then was such a big deal. So I'll give like a little bit of education to, you know, maybe say read this or watch that. Because sometimes people think there's something wrong with them, the way I did, but there's nothing wrong with us. It's just the way we look or the position we hold in society that's the problem. There's actually nothing wrong with us. And it took me a long time to realize that, because I studied sociology first, and I think that was a good thing. I studied sociology first. I was a Marxist. I was so left-wing, you know, and I think that was really good because I then understood like the structural oppression of being poor, of being Black, of being female. And then I got into psychology and eventually therapy and started to understand that your psychological development is very compromised by things that oppress you. So yeah, I think education is very, very important. The right education. Good
I'm
stuff.
Also noticing, well, I mean, also it's just, there's so much that you've shared already that's really helpful. And I think for a lot of people who might not also be aware of the context and how the environment and society has changed, this shift from the 60s and trying to imagine what life was like 60s into the 90s and 90s into the 2000s, it's, although someone may say, for example, certain things are still the same, it's all happening, the key point there is to actually try and place yourself in that situation and to hear what people are saying and to imagine what it's like to be perceived, for example, as someone who is mixed in a society where, like say, both sides are saying this shouldn't be happening. And that contrast also of being very visible in the location that you were at and being almost very invisible when it comes to actually the people who should be very close and should have their eyes on you all the time, and growing up without those eyes on you. And like you say, how that can affect someone, how perhaps there's even that thing of a child wants to please their parents, and that's why some people might get into education really quickly or try and perform really well at school. And when that element's missing, where's your compass? Where's your direction? What's the purpose of trying to do this when I feel this certain way? So there's a lot of layered information that you've given there about the context that you've experienced, and to experience the shifts and the changes and the shock of all of it coming back as well. It's very, very intriguing to me. I'm not sure at which phase the self-education started, because you started mentioning the self-education. So I feel like it initially was coming from yourself, and then, like you say, you tried to make perhaps a few different things, and then you identified the right path that you were trying to learn. I might have misread that. But...
No, I think from my understanding, interviewing people for my PhD and the clients that I see now, I think if you grow up very isolated, if you're mixed race or brown or Black, and you grow up very isolated from your own community, and you're kind of swimming in a sea of whiteness, and there's questions all the time. Somebody said to me a few weeks ago, somebody who's mixed race, who was transracially adopted, said, I've heard this before, what they used to say at school was things like, my parents left me out in the sun, my adoptive parents left me out in the sun too long, or my foster parents left me on the beach and that's how I got so brown. And that's like something, that's like we have to make up stories, because there's something called the burden of narrative. If you're different, you carry this burden of narrative. People will ask you questions. People want to know your story. So you have to find a story. So you'll find a story from wherever you can make up a story. So you'll say, yeah, left me on the beach, or left me out too long in the sun. And that will shut up the little kid from next door. But when you then find people are being racist towards you because of the way you look, that story doesn't work. You can't understand racism by the fact that you were left on the beach or you left in the sun for too long. That doesn't help you to understand why people are being so hostile towards you as a child. So you're then thinking, this doesn't make sense. Why does the fact that I was left on the beach create such hostility? And then I think this is why I think I became, and a lot of the people I work with, you become an existential philosopher. You're literally trying to work out the meaning of your life and the meaning of lots of things. And there's all these little philosophers growing up. Like, why am I here? Why am I here? And why don't I look like everybody else? Maybe I'm an alien. Maybe I literally dropped off a spaceship. And that would explain why I look so different to everybody else. So I think the question stopped. I think the theory is that once a child is 3, they understand racial differences in the way that the races are treated. So that's very young if you think about it.
Yes.
So I think, the questions start very young. You don't get the answers you need. And so it kind of like sets you off on this quest. And I loved reading, and a lot of people I've encountered personally or that I work with, if your external world is so threatening and so difficult, you develop a very robust internal world. It's a place you can escape to.
Yeah.
And it's all right in here. It's okay in here. I can make up stories. I can read, and reading takes you into a whole other world, doesn't it?
Yeah.
You know, so, or you can draw. I mean, all these graphic artists, you know, listen to their stories. Why were they spending hours and hours and hours and hours drawing? You know, or artists or musicians, you know. So I think if you have a very troubled external world, it can lead to a very rich internal world, which is great. And we'll come on to that again, because that's kind of going into resilience. But yeah,
I mean, that's fascinating. Again, I almost want to break this question into 3 because
go.
So I will then. So I'm just now thinking, because I normally only ask it for 1, and I ask the person to pick which phase they would like. I'd like to ask what advice you'd give to your younger self. But now I'm almost very curious to hear about the advice that would go to the child self, the adolescent going into the teen self, and in particular, the version of you that is then coming across the information about perhaps not perhaps, about not being your existence, not being expressed to the other parties. Like, what advice would you have liked to have received, for example, at those phases, or knowing what you know now? If we begin with, say, the child.
I think I'll do 7. I'll do 7. I think at 7, I would never say it's going to get better. I would say you're going to find the strength to endure it, is what I would say. And remember that for all the people you meet who are hostile towards you or hateful towards you, you will meet a whole load of other people who are not, regardless of race, color, or creed. Every group in society has this kind of person and that kind of person. And don't forget that, and don't mix that up and think that this group's better than that group, because it's not true. You'll find the same elements in every group, is what I would say. So just hold on to that, because that's going to really be important. Don't start to hate based on if you see a person from a certain group, don't start on hating just because they're from that group, because you know that actually there's other people in that group who are very kind.
Perfect. And well, let's go with the 18-year-old or 18 to 21-year-old version.
I moved to London when I was 18. So I would say never lose that excitement. you know, that excitement of everything being new and amazing, and there's so much to learn and see and do. Never lose that excitement in the world. I was very angry, very angry. Learn where to direct that anger.
What was the anger about? Ask any 18-year-old the world.
I think a lot of it was racism. So when I was 18, that's 1980, was a very bad time. The National Front were very strong. I left Birmingham in 1980. The National Front were very, very strong. And in those days, what that meant was, you know, I'd be walking down the road, minding my own business, and a whole car full of white guys would just start shouting at you, you know, telling you to get out the country, calling you the worst names possible. And you're like this little girl, and I was really small. I was very tiny, and I'd be walking along, and there'd be a car full of white guys just screaming at you. You know, that's what it was like. So that obviously makes you very angry because you can't do anything. I can't stop them, beat them all up. I would love to have been able to do that, you know. So that makes you very, very angry. And I think, so 18, I was just coming out of the care system. So I was in care from when I was like 9 months to about 18, a bit longer than 18, because I did this college course, so I stayed a little bit longer. So just coming out of the care system with lots of questions and, you know, lots of anger, because let's face it, the care system is not a great place. You know, that did make me very rebellious, you know, the kind of authority part of it. And
thank you for listening to Men Talk Ubuntu podcast and being a valued member of our community. Remember to subscribe to our YouTube, Instagram, and other social media now for access to our latest updates. DM us and let us know what your mental health is on a scale of 1 to 5. Thank you.
But, you know, there was this fun element to it as well, which we'll get into later. But I think 18, like maybe mostly I would say, look, just calm down. Look, calm down. Just calm down. You know, take a breath, calm down. Because I was like this little maniac, basically, of energy and anger. But there was nothing solid. Like I said, I was really petite and very, very skinny. I mean, I used to wear children's clothes when I was 18. Wow. So there's nothing grounded. You could just blow me away, you know. So it would be like, calm down and get grounded, you know, get down on the ground and be grounded.
Was part of this the newfound freedom and this, although, like, say you're moving to London, I'm assuming it's a bit more cosmopolitan and mixed, and so maybe you don't stand out as much. I'm not certain, but, or is it just, so I'm wondering if that energy was a new beginning, a new chapter, and loads of new opportunities and potential connections.
I think it was, there was the cosmopolitan part of it was definitely better. You know, it was definitely better on that level, definitely. I think what I really liked was just, I don't know what it was, trying out lots of new identities. Like, you could literally, there was a shop in Old Street. I went to Sixth Form College in Old Street. There was a shop there called Flip, and people my generation would remember Flip. It was amazing. And you could buy 50s clothes. It was like a warehouse full of boxes and boxes of 50s clothes. So, you know, you could go there and you could walk out looking like Diana Ross in the Supremes, you know, for not very much money. Because people weren't into vintage, people weren't into retro, not like they are now, where it's about the money. Yes. So that was great. You could just try out identities and personas and kind of trying to work out who you are. And clothes are a big part of that, aren't they? For me, they were a big part.
I think they've been a big part for me. I think there's always transitions, and even now. But one of the biggest transitions, for example, that I had was moving from the, should we say, the baggy clothes look. And I resisted for years.
Yes.
Until I actually, for
Yeah.
whatever reason, tried some
Yeah.
out, and I was like,
Yeah.
wow, this fits beautifully. And
Yeah.
there's also
Yeah.
such a difference with things like suits. When you wear a
Yeah.
loose, baggy suit, and even
Yeah.
you don't really want to wear it because you're like, oh, this
Yeah.
looks awful, versus
Yeah.
proper fitting one. Oh my
Yeah.
goodness. It's not just maturity. Like there is
Yeah.
you carry yourself differently, and
Yeah.
when you've picked an outfit that speaks to you, and
Yeah.
you're like, this coat is me. Like I am
Yeah.
Diana Ross today. Like
Yeah.
there is a
Yeah.
huge, and it changes your energy. Like you're
It
saying, like you
does.
move
It
differently.
does. It does. I think clothes are really important, and I hate it if I'm wearing something and I'm in an environment and I just don't feel right. So I tend to dress, now I'm older, I tend to dress in what I call very smart cash. So wherever I go, it's usually okay. You know, I hate walking into somewhere and thinking, no, this isn't working. I do not match the room, you know. So yeah, no, clothes are very important. Very, very important. Yeah.
Fantastic. I'm very glad to see that energy hasn't left. It's more controlled, it's more tame, but it's there. I love that. I really love that. You've taken your own advice already. It's brilliant.
Yeah.
Someone else
Yeah.
should be listening to this advice, and they are.
Yeah.
And the final piece of advice that you would give to,
and
say,
what age would I be now?
I'm assuming this is 30, 32, something like that. So this is the period where we're discovering that we weren't revealed to our grandparents, for example.
Okay, yeah. Oh, right. So that was intense. Being 30, 32 is intense. I don't know if you're into astrology, but I am. A lot of people find that really strange, being an academic, but I'm really into astrology.
Please
the thing
enlighten.
that happens around the time you're 29, called your second Saturn return. Okay. And so Saturn's in exactly the same position as when you were born. And it usually brings big stuff, like big stuff. So it brought me some big stuff. I finished my first degree in sociology. My foster mother died, and I found my birth mother, and she died within 9 months. So that was like, wow, such a lot to deal with. And I think that was probably, I think that's got to be one of the hardest times. That was one of the hardest. It was like, what is going on? This just isn't fair, you know. I've done this, I've done this, I've done, and now this. It's like, this isn't even fair, you know. So I think that was hard, and I had to. I think it kind of propelled me into this spiritual journey. Again, more existentialism. Like, nothing's making sense, you know. I've done my sociology degree. I've done some psychology. None of this makes sense. This is about, you know, how do you just be in the world when things can just get thrown at you like that? So I guess my advice at that time would be just explore, you know, whatever you need to, whatever corner you need to look in, or journey you need to take right now. It doesn't matter, just keep looking and the answers will come. You know, you are on your own, but there's going to be more insight after this. It just seems like it's just pain.
Yeah,
it's just pain right now, but it's going to become meaningful. I guess, like, you're going to use this one day. All of this, you're going to use it one day, which I do now, obviously, in my work. I do use it all now. And I was having a conversation with another therapist who's a South Asian therapist.
Yes.
And we were talking about kind of like the fee we charge for therapy doesn't reflect all of what we're offering. And I was sort of saying to her, so all those things that have happened to me, they're there in the room when I'm with a client, and they're talking about grief or death or a loss that feels they can't recover from it, or they're in that existential crisis place. All of that is there in the room. All of that is available. but that's not on my website, and it's not when I break down the fee, but it's all there. And I guess I would say, you're going to use it. You're going to use it. You might not see how right now, but it's going to be useful. And that's something that will come out of this, something.
I think that's just a very wonderful message for anyone going through anything right now, to just imagine and think, because one of the amazing ways that you put it is it's the pain as much as the existential is crisis, just that pain. And is this it? Especially when that's against the backdrop of I've just finished my qualifications. This is supposed to be an amazing time in my life. I've gone through supposedly the hard stuff so that life can open up now, and it doesn't. And when we're in real pain, all we want to do is curl up into a ball, really, and not move and just be static, stay where we are. So to be encouraged to actually keep moving, don't just stop and keep questioning everything and ruminating on why it's not fair. Take some action and take some solace in knowing that it'll be okay. Eventually, this will be useful for something. It's helping you or shaping you for something. I'm really in admiration with the healthy, I want to say, relationship that you have with all these versions of yourself, these previous versions of yourself, because I think we underrate how resilient and strong we are. But when we look at the history objectively a bit, sometimes it's helpful because we see what we've gone through and at what age we were. If you look back to your 7-year-old self, like the 7-year-old doesn't really know much of anything, but look at what the 7-year-old you coped with, and the 18-year-old. Any 18-year-old right now, you think you know everything, but you don't, but you won't listen. It's fine. And again, you still cope with all this, and with taking on or moving to a completely different environment, which a lot of 18-year-olds will do most of the time. It takes a lot of courage to do that and to cope with the changes and to navigate your identity and not just be shaped by everything around you. And then, of course, once we hit, say, our 30s and life starts to ask us serious questions and it starts to throw some very serious obstacles our way, I think most of us between that age and into the 40s and sometimes into the 50s, that's where the existentialist crises, if you haven't had them before, no matter what walk of life, they start to knock at your door. And yeah, it's just wonderful to hear how healthily you look back at all these things and how it's all paid off. And I think that's genuinely the way that all of us should see it. It's all temporary to some extent. Well, of course, in the moment, it feels like it's not.
I think, yeah, I'm gonna, okay. Yeah. The mistake I made, and I didn't kind of get to correct it until I did my PhD. So of course I did my PhD on resilience and trauma, and I looked at people who've grown up in care.
Yes. And
I wanted to understand their resilience. How did they get through it, and how did they manage that? And I hadn't seen it the way it turned out after doing the interviews and really thinking about it. The one thing I had never done was accept my vulnerability. I was very uncomfortable with being vulnerable. So my version of resilience used to be what I call brittle. So I could be knocked over. I was kind of like a tree that's so tall and straight, but when a wind comes along, it'll just knock it over. Whereas you see other trees that sway. You know, like in Japan, they build buildings that sway, so that when there's an earthquake, they don't fall down. They don't build rigid buildings. And I think I made a mistake that a lot of people make, is thinking that resilience is something rigid and something hard and something that is impenetrable. And when I became more comfortable with my vulnerability, I actually have become a lot stronger, because recognizing my vulnerability, it makes a much better self-care. When you first contacted me about doing this interview, I was like, yes, I can, but it's going to have to be then. Whereas before I would have said, yeah, we'll do it tomorrow. We'll do it tomorrow. And then I'll do 5 more on Saturday, and I'll do 10 next week. And I'll just keep going. And then I'll collapse. Because what used to happen was I would go like that. And then like maybe every year or so, I would just completely collapse with physical illnesses or burnt out kind of mental state. It would take me like 3 to 6 months to recover. And then I'd go at it again. But what I've had to learn to do is really pace myself. And really kind of like, it's like a traffic light system. So like at the moment I'm green.
Great. Because we had the time off.
I'm green. So, but if I had booked like an interview every day for next week and some writing and all my clients, you know, by the end of next week, I'd be amber flashing red.
Yeah.
You know, so that's what I had to learn, was that I am vulnerable. I am vulnerable. And to really honor that, really honor that, because it shows me when I'm getting to the point where I might burn out or I might get really sick physically, which used to happen. I could kind of keep going, and then I get flu or something unexplainable. And then somebody said to me, a natural healer said to me, you do realize if you push yourself hard enough, you start creating your own viruses that attack you. And that made so much sense when he said that. I was like, no, I don't want to create any more viruses that attack me. It's horrible. It feels terrible. And then you're getting into like, what is it? Chronic fatigue. That's plagued me all my adult life, is this chronic fatigue. But now I realize that if I just manage myself better, I don't get that. Yeah. So vulnerability, yeah, I would go right back to the 18-year-old. Because the 7-year-old could show it, I think. I'd go back to the 18-year-old, I'd go back to the 30-something, I'd say, where's your vulnerability? You know, embrace it. It's gonna serve you so well. It's gonna really serve you well.
Yeah, because that put in my mind this image of a diamond when you were saying you have to be rigid and impenetrable. And everyone, let's say once we're 18 and moving forward, we want to be seen as the diamond. I'm beautiful, I'm sparkling, check me out, nothing can hurt me, nothing can break me. Yeah. And yet, if we were instead to think more like water, which, as we know, can tear through a mountain, it's fluid. That is just a beautiful way of being resilient. And even when you mentioned the tree, there is, I think, a saying or a quote that is, the tree that does not bend will break. Or the branch, but one of the two. And it's exactly that, like how you're able to take those knocks or whatever happens in life will determine your ability to keep moving. Because if you break, you're not a tree. You can mend and get back.
You can mend,
but it does also then take a while to mend.
It takes a while.
Like this managing is just okay, it's pushing me, and you get better at knowing where breaking point is. And bringing it back the other way. Now the secret is sometimes it'll be still, but most times there's something's going on somewhere.
It's so important. And I think, you know, it's going to sound really strange, but when I'm working with a young male Black client and he's sitting there for 50 minutes on the Zoom crying, that is a great moment to see somebody able to show that vulnerability. And those tears, they're like diamonds, you know, they really are, because that's such a difficult thing to do. It's such a difficult thing to do, to show your vulnerability, especially I think if you're young and Black and male. It's really difficult if you're young and Black and female as well. That's really, really difficult, you know. So many of my young Black female clients, like, I don't like the word vulnerability. I don't even like that word. Or they go, Yvonne, you know, like the V word. But once they begin to embrace it, what they start to realize is their mental health starts to get better, you know, because they're able to really feel that something's not right, and then say, okay, what's my list for this week? Let's take some things off the list, you know, and then maybe my week's going to go better, my month's going to go better, and I might get through this year.
That's it. Take it one step at a time.
Yeah.
So, you know, I just to speak about resiliency and trauma, and now also vulnerability, which it's all part of the same circle or cycle, and it links to other things as well. I love learning about this, and I love how you were doing your PhD on resilience and trauma, but ultimately you were asking other people the questions, but you're the one who started to really ask yourself some questions.
Well, I was doing that going along because it was a very reflective piece.
Okay, yes.
So I was asking myself questions all along, but yeah, yeah, you're quite right. I had to dig really deep. You know, you always think, yeah, I'm going to dig deep. I know how to reflect, but the reality sometimes is it's so much deeper than you think.
The deeper you go, the deeper you realize you have to go.
Yeah.
So I know we've started touching on vulnerability, and I want to ask more about accepting your vulnerability and what that all means. But I think it's also important, in case some people haven't come across some of these concepts like resilience and trauma, that perhaps we give an easy introduction to them, or just what they're about as well.
Yeah. So obviously, if you do something like a PhD, you have to define certain things so that when you write it up, people know what your definition is. So that can take a long time. You read a lot of things and then you think, okay, now I've got a definition I feel like I can work with. So my definition for trauma, it turned out I wanted to go with a definition that trauma is experiences that we have that overwhelm us to a large extent, right? So that they trouble us. And so experience should be like food. Okay, we eat food, we digest it, it nourishes us, if it's good food. If it's good food. And experience can be the same. So something like education is good. We digest it, we learn, we hopefully get a better outcome in life. But there's some experiences that we have that we can't make sense of. So when you think of the smaller version of me that was trying to understand racism, you know, if you can't make sense of something, that can become traumatizing. It's just too puzzling. Or if you're very oppressed, I talked about the care system, but we've been in austerity for nearly 14 years. Some people have been so oppressed by poverty, that is traumatizing. And the powerlessness that goes with being poor, like when I spoke about my parents.
Yes.
That the kind of power, the kids being taken into care now because their parents are poor. That's the only reason, because they're using food banks, because they're living in really bad rented accommodation. The kids are going into care, especially after COVID. So those kinds of experiences are traumatizing because they're very difficult to make sense of and they overwhelm us. So that was a definition of trauma that I wanted to work with, that you can have one big traumatic event, like all your family dies, that's traumatic, or you can have like a slow build up. This thing happens and then that thing happens and then that thing happens. So like microaggressions, you know, enough of those is going to be traumatic. You can have someone shouting you out of a car, that's a microaggression, but you can have people doing that to you and looking at you a bit funny every day at work, at school, on the bus, you know, that builds up. So that was how I went with trauma, things we can't make sense of, things we can't process. And that worked fine. That worked fine, and it still works. It still works when I talk to clients about race. You can give people any definition they want about race. You can say it's because of colonialism. You can say it's because of capitalism. You can say it's because of any theory that you like, okay? But when you experience it, it doesn't make sense if you really think about it. If someone burst into your house now and started attacking you and shouting it's because of the color of your skin, I'd be sitting here going, that doesn't make sense. You know, yeah, I know he's a racist. I know what racism is, but to behave like that, it doesn't make sense. So I think racism is deeply traumatic, because however much we try to understand it and rationalize it, when it's happening to you, it's overwhelming. It makes you feel powerless, and you cannot make sense of it. You just can't make sense of it. So that was the definition of trauma I went with, was things that overwhelm us and we can't process them, which is why therapy is good. because you get to unpack all those things and process them, okay? And then resilience, that was much more difficult, because resilience, the word didn't exist 40 years ago. It didn't exist. So when we talk about something like the Second World War and the spirit of the Blitz, the Londoners that withstood all the bombs, nobody would have called them resilient, ever, ever. Nobody would have called slaves resilient, ever. No one ever would have said, oh, those slaves were so resilient, because the word didn't exist. So it's a new word, and it's come, there's no agreed definition, which I really like. So when I'm doing presentations, I can say to people, you know, whatever you think of it, you're not wrong, because there's no agreed definition. But the definition most people go with is that something bad happens to you, you get over it, and you're positive at the end of it, right? Like, that doesn't make sense. Not the people I knew in the care system, not my own behavior, not the people I've worked with, not the people I see around me in the inner city. That doesn't make sense. That's like sort of saying there's a good resilience and a bad resilience, okay? So I really didn't like that. And then I started finding some work from Australia and America that was more about race and more about saying that people put in very powerless, oppressive situations, they are resilient. We have to change the way we're looking at resilience. They are being resilient in the face of what's oppressing them. That is resilience. And I thought, I like that. That's good for me. And then what I realized was the problem was people had mixed up two kinds of resilience. So I said, okay, let's split this up. We're going to have the first kind. We're going to call it surviving. And it means if you are still breathing, you are resilient. Because the people I interviewed and the people that I've worked with, they may have tried to kill themselves many times. Someone else may have tried to kill them many times. Parents, carers, peers, gangs, you know, the state. You may have been in horrible living conditions, you know. There's so many things that can take you out of the game. So if you were still breathing, I said, that's it, that's okay. That's one kind of resilience, is to survive. But there's another kind, which is when you move beyond that level. And a lot of my clients and myself weren't able to move beyond that level. So I think I was in my early 30s. I kept thinking, I'm sure I could be doing more. I'm sure I could be doing more. I seem to be still on benefits. I seem to be still in low paid jobs. Why aren't I doing better? And some of the time it's because the path is hard, but sometimes some of your survival techniques are keeping you on the survival level. The anger, the aggression, you know, the kind of like the mental health problems, the addictions, all of these things will keep you on the survival level. And you're great at it. You know, you'll meet those people. You're like, wow, that person survived. Look at them. They're amazing. They're so good at surviving. If a nuclear bomb dropped, that person would survive. But it's nice to think that we can do more than that. And that's what most of my clients are struggling with. And that's what they relate to on my website is they say, do you know, I read your website and it made such sense. I'm surviving, but I want to do more. I want to do more. So then we have a look at what their resilience is. So this thing about vulnerability is a huge problem. If you want a relationship, if you want a healthy relationship, but you're one of these people, I do it all by myself. I do it all by myself. I do it by myself. I don't need anybody. I don't need anyone. I can do it all. It's just me, there's me, and there's me. That's great, but you can't have a relationship with somebody else if that's your philosophy. Because you've got to show some vulnerability to let them in. So there's two types of resilience. One is to survive, and the other is to get beyond that. And when you get beyond that, different doors open. You can be creative. You can follow that music career. You can get your education. You can have healthy relationships with yourself, with other people. It's just getting to a better place.
Hope you enjoyed listening as much as we enjoyed creating.
Don't forget to follow, like, share, and connect with us on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn. Subscribe to our latest episode and listen to any you missed. And tune in next episode.
Take care.